Good morning. You can see we have a new bleacher section in the back. It's already filled up. They're less expensive, quite frankly, if you want to sit back there. We've been attempting to discern the answer to two questions that Moses asked God at the burning bush. Who am I? And in turn, who are you, God? And you'll recall Moses, along with Israel, dare I say the world, had forgotten God's name. They forgot who God was and who God is, what God is like, what his essence was and is. They knew God like many in the book of Genesis knew God. They knew God as El, as the great power, as Elohim, as El Shaddai. They knew respect, but God wanted more. God wants more. God wants intimacy. So he gave Moses his name, at least the closest thing that Moses could grasp, maybe. And despite this clear introduction to his name that God gives him, Moses keeps calling him El. And so God is very persistent and very patient. God just kept referring to himself in his real name, and Moses kept calling him El until Moses finally got it. Yahweh, the I am. I was, I am, I will be. And I have redefined that for our purposes here as the always. And partly what is so significant to me about this self-existent eternal name of God, the always, is that we can now attach that name to any great good attribute of God's. Faithful, loving, merciful, attentive listener, active rememberer. We looked at that last week. Provider, forgiver, encourager, uplifter, generous, sovereign, just. Always was, always is, always will be. So we'll turn the page to the plagues now for the coming weeks. And I'm excited about these next 3 weeks. And I'm going to see if we can see this same idea of intimacy, this quality of intimacy of God in the midst of some very, very hard things. The plagues are, how shall we say, rough, to say the least. The Nile turns to blood. The frogs, the gnats, the flies, the death of the Egyptian livestock. Then my personal favorite, the boils. Ugh. Hail, but not like hail that we have ever seen since or will see. Locusts, darkness, but darkness not like we're used to at nighttime. Darkness of a different kind. And finally, the massive unleashing, as if the 9 weren't enough, the death of every firstborn child, if the house that they were in did not have the blood of a lamb smeared across the doorposts and down the sides. Now, can you imagine how this would be seen in today's culture? And to be honest, I get it. It's rough. This doesn't look exactly to me like my image of intimacy. So we have to ask, what is going on? Did we really need all these plagues? 10 of them, to be exact. And by the way, before the 10 plagues, there were 3 signs that God gave to Moses to give to the Pharaoh before he ever got to the signs. So now it's 13. And each time in between each plague, Moses begs Pharaoh to release God's people. And Pharaoh says yes every single time, just to get out of the weight of the torment, like a teenager trying to confess his sins just to get out of the restriction that he's under, only to stiffen right back up after God relents. It's this constant, repetitive, ugly scene. And next week, I want to wrestle with why God even wanted this guy's permission. God goes out of the way to get this guy's permission, which is really odd to me. We'll wrestle with that next week. But first, I want to wrestle with, in part, why God unleashes these 10 plagues on Pharaoh and Egypt. And by the way, there are some strange things to be seen within these plagues. And then the specific interactions between Moses and Pharaoh. And I know what you're thinking when I say that. Yeah, these plagues are weird. But I mean something beyond the plagues. Extremely strange interactions that I had never seen before until I restudied this. And details that we're gonna look at that you just kind of glance over when you're reading your Bible. And they have to do with the difference between precision and power. And again, our goal is to simply wrestle with what this tells us of the intimacy of Yahweh, the always. So let me first cover some of these kind of strange nuances that take place, and we'll just grab a few of them. There's more, but we'll just look at like 4 of them in the plagues, and then we're going to return and ask why it matters. So we'll look at first, what is God doing? And then finally, how does it speak to his name? This is what we want to get to. God, what is your name? If it's Yahweh, if you're the always, how are you being intimate in these plagues? So let's start with these strange nuances and this idea of precision versus power. Pharaoh's behavior and his reactions over the course of the Exodus story provide us with just this rich source of evidence for understanding the larger kind of significance of the Exodus events. The ancient Jewish sages of the Talmud and the Midrash do this awesome job of kind of highlighting these really peculiar interactions within the plagues and share with us details that you're like, why do I need to know this? So let's just take few. We're going to look at 4. First of all, the first example, I call it the strike of midnight. We'll start in Exodus 11. So Moses said, "Thus says Yahweh, about midnight, I will go out in the midst of Egypt, and every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die. From the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle." The sages read this text, by the way, in ancient times, and they wondered, why does Moses seem to almost fudge the time? When you or I say the word about, we're kind of hedging our bet, right? So rather than, we're safe than sorry. So if you say to me, why don't you come over for dinner? I'll say to you something like, we'll be there around or about 5. Now, this gives me a lot of leeway. First of all, I know coming early is terrible. Second of all, this gives me at least, I would say, 15, 20 minutes is probably on the edge, unless it's maybe another culture, then I can go to like 35, 40. I would never show up at 6:15. This is just flat out rude. But you say about or around 5. But listen to God's version when God actually does the firstborn striking. Exodus 12. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt. That's a little strange, right? God is very precise on the time, even after Moses hedges the time just in case God's a little late. Very polite. Now, we can kind of accept that. That's not that big a nuance. Let's go to the next example. I call this one the frogs no more. The second plague is the infestation of frogs. There is more to this, by the way, than meets the eye, and we're going to come back to the frogs very briefly in a couple weeks. But let's again look at this idea of precision versus power. Now, there are, in this plague, frogs. And when I say there are frogs, and I mean frogs everywhere. They're in the beds, they're in the cupboards, they're in the food, they're in your underwear, they're in the streets, they are everywhere. It is a gross, disgusting nightmare. Now, I want you to listen with that image to what God asks Pharaoh through Moses. Listen to Exodus chapter 8, verse 8. Then Pharaoh called to Moses and Aaron, I think this is just hilarious, and he said, "Plead with the Lord to take away the frogs from me and from my people, and I will let the people go to sacrifice to the Lord." Moses said to Pharaoh, "Be pleased to command me when I am to plead for you and for your servants and for your people, that the frogs be cut off from you and your houses and be left only in the Nile." What? Frogs are everywhere. You are losing your proverbial mind. And Moses says, when would you like them gone? Are you kidding me? What a stupid question. The right question is what? Do you want me to get rid of them? Right? That's the right question. Another time deal, though, we have. Another precision deal. What is Moses saying? He says to Pharaoh, give me something you don't actually think I can do. I'll tell you what, getting rid of them's nothing. You pick the time, and we'll see if I can call off the frogs at precisely when you ask me to have them gone. And I will do this with God. Now, what would your answer be if you were Pharaoh? Right now. Actually, the real answer is yesterday. That's the obvious answer. But check out what Pharaoh says in chapter 8 when we read on. And he, Pharaoh, said, tomorrow. Now we have two idiots in the room. Moses said, be it as you say. What? Are you kidding? Pharaoh was willing to go through this for another day just to see if this God of Moses can do it. And if Moses has this God's ear. That's the important element here. Moses takes the bait, and this is what Moses says. And he, Pharaoh, said, tomorrow. Moses said, be it as you say, so that you will know that there is no one like Yahweh, our God. See, it's as if turning off the plagues at a precise time is more important to Pharaoh than the miraculous event of actually getting rid of the frogs. Precision versus power. Again, what is God doing, and what is Pharaoh looking for? Example number 3, just in case you're still not buying into this. The cattle's wrong question, I call it. A few plagues later, we have number 5. And it's a strange kind of plague because only Egypt's livestock die. Israel's livestock are totally fine. Right next to each other, Egyptian cow dies, Israelite cattle stands tall. Now, imagine you're the Pharaoh. You are Egypt's sovereign ruler. What's the first question you would ask when all of your cattle die? What is the damage to our country? That's what you want to know. How bad is it? How is it going to affect our food moving forward? What's the impact of our economy? This is what you would ask, but of course not. Not in our Bible. That's not what Pharaoh asks at all. Exodus 9:7. And Pharaoh sent, and behold, not one of the livestock of Israel was dead. But the heart of Pharaoh was hardened, and he did not let the people go. Pharaoh seemingly doesn't even bother with his own losses. All he cares about is the precision with which it happened. It's the strangest damage report of all time. When we read the story, we tend to think there was this kind of simple test of wills going on between Pharaoh and God over the kind of the release of Pharaoh's slaves. But maybe the test of wills isn't entirely what we think it is. Maybe Pharaoh was battling God over something for which precision, precisely, and strangely counts even more. So let's just say what we've covered. First of all, this is what we've covered. God, Yahweh, displays power and control over entirely different facets of the natural world. Facets that normally individual gods controlled. If you controlled the water like a frog, you did not control the land like a livestock. Those are separate gods in the pantheon of Egypt. And now this God of Moses and Israel, Yahweh, is controlling all of the facets by himself. Number 2, and this is the real kicker to me, God, Yahweh, uses consummate precision, even predicting in advance as to when and where They begin and end. And he's coordinating it through a human being. The gods, first of all, didn't do this. Second of all, they wouldn't do this. Now, finally, and this is our third, God, Yahweh, displays his brilliance by causing diametrically opposed natural forces to work in harmony towards a common goal. Well, where do we see that? Now we turn to plague number 7, which, by the way, we're going to go back to number 7 a lot. Number 7 is the turning point of the whole story, believe it or not. It's the hail. Listen to what the text says about plague number 7 and the hail. Exodus 9. There was hail, now listen, and fire flashing continually in the midst of the hail, very heavy hail, such as had never been in all the land of Egypt since it became a nation. Egypt had seen hail. This is not new. Let me tell you what they had never seen, that anybody has ever seen before or since. Fire inside of the hail. What? Why do we need to know this? Fire and ice together in one hailstone. What is Yahweh doing? He is simultaneously controlling opposing forces. And to Egypt and to Pharaoh, these were separate gods that never cooperated. Why? Because the gods were only about power, not relationship. And Yahweh was doing this in participation with Moses, specific, precise requests. Yahweh was working in relationship with Moses, a human, in an intimate, precise way. Now, God made, by the way, all this fuss. We've been looking at this for 2 weeks already. God made all this fuss about wanting intimacy over respect, right? We've been looking at this. He wants to be known as the always, as the I am, as Yahweh. He doesn't want to be known as El, as the power. And then what does he go and do? He displays massive power and control beyond what any of the gods have ever done. But he does it with massive precision. So we have to keep asking what is going on. Well, first, before we can answer that, let's just wrestle with a little technicality here for just a couple minutes. So stick with me. I want to introduce this concept of polytheism versus monotheism. Poly, many, mono, one. Polytheism, or paganism, we will call it. Polytheism or paganism was the dominant system in the ancient world. The gods of the pantheon of Egypt in their time, they were much like, say, the Greek gods. They were about El. They were about power. And when something is just about power, it isn't personal. It's about fear. I love what the Rabbi Foreman said. Its logic is the none too subtle calculus of fear. And any interaction with the gods, with the L's, little g, was about simply trying to somehow win their favor, to earn their favor without frustrating them to the point of anger. How do I bug them enough to get them to do what I want, but not bug them so much they just release their backhand on me? Conversely, every L or deity had their own area of vulnerability because they weren't all powerful. We can say it in a biblical way. They weren't I am. They weren't Yahweh. If you lived by the coast, for example, you would worship Dagon, the god of fish. That's what the Philistines worshiped. If you lived in Egypt, you might worship the sun god, right? Because you need crops. Of course, that is until the sun god got a little too aggressive with you and started burning everything. And then you would turn to the rain god and have him overpower the sun god, right? Number one, pick your god for the moment. Number two, appease that god, realizing all along they are powerful, but they are not all powerful. And they are definitely not kind, and they are definitely not loving because they are not relational. They only know power and thus fear. And the more powerful the sacrifice, the better the results. This is why in the Old Testament, and we know this in history, they sacrificed their children on fires to Molech and gods like this. Why would you sacrifice your child, your baby, to a god to appease them? Because all those gods knew was power and fear. And the most troublesome of all the gods of Egypt was none other than Pharaoh himself. I mean, you have to think about it. What belief, what idea did Pharaoh subscribe to that made it possible for him to just justify his own actions towards humanity? Think about just these three things. First of all, what drove Pharaoh's paranoia to think that Israel would turn against him when they had lived in peace and harmony with his people for hundreds of years? Not only that, Israel saved Egypt from famine through Joseph. Well, second of all, what drove him then to enslave these innocent people for no reason whatsoever, torturing them and enacting brutal force on them? And then finally, what drove him to commit mass genocide against Israel's little boys? In short, he had power, and power produces fear, and the result is mass injustice and failure. The gods don't command morality. The gods don't command justice or mercy or healing. They command power. And it's funny, and I have this reaction, and I'm sure you do too. When we hear this about, say, the pantheon, and how we just think, how stupid is this? Like you're worshiping a piece of wood or a thing that rises up in the morning and goes down in the evening. What are these people doing, worshiping the sun? What a bunch of knotheads. Right? We are just so much more advanced than the Egyptians. And then we turn around and we serve a completely different set of power-driven, unrelational gods that will never, ever, ever have your best interest at heart. The Bible word for this is a harsh word. The Bible word is idolatry. This is our biggest problem, by the way. And I've taught on this many times. Sin is not our real problem. Idolatry is our problem. What is idolatry? It's trying to find life through something other than the real God. It actually just means we're handing to a non-divine force a power and authority that they were never supposed to have to begin with. And then the very thing that was meant and given to serve us requires us to serve it. Pagan gods always promise they are helping you and serving you, and then you end up serving them. This produces sin or missing the mark of the greatness of what God intended us to be. And this causes a chain reaction that binds us from being truly happy and truly free. Sex, money, power, image, even small things like needing recognition and appreciation. Like fire, these forces are great servants and they're lousy masters. It's then the choice of death over life. Why? Again, because you are giving a non-divine force power they were never supposed to have to begin with, and they can only produce letdown and death. You know, the gods we end up serving, they have no real power. They only have the power that we hand to them when we serve them and make them out to be God. I meant to do this. Does somebody close to me have like a piece of money in their wallet? Of course Matt does. Give me a bill. Give me a big one, Matt. Give me a nice big one. Now these are donations too, so thank you. Gives me a 20. That's the biggest bill you've got? Okay. We all know what this is. We all have this. We all need this. As the great Jimmy Stewart said, and it's a wonderful story, comes in pretty handy down here, bub. This is a big deal to us. Do you know, this thing has no real power. I mean, can't fly, can't make anything on its own, can't really produce anything. It's a neutral thing until we serve it. Now, this is going to bother you, but I'm going to crumple it and throw it back. Thank you. This is why, by the way, God asks us to give a minimum in the Old Testament of 10% before taxes away. And then the New Testament comes away and says, oh, that was just the minimum. Now you got to do it with hilarity and laughing while you give it away. Why would God do this? To keep it from having power. See, we're just God's stewards. It's not really ours to begin with. We take nothing with us when we die. And I know what you're thinking if you're new here. The church must need money. The church doesn't need money. Give whatever you need to give, want to give. And by the way, I'm not paid and never have been paid for doing what I do up here, so it's not about that. I'm saying this because God knows how to free us from the tyranny of a non-divine force. And the same, by the way, goes for career and success and recognition and appreciation, or locking into your kids' success or how you look, or even things like the quest for safety or health or longevity. None of these have power until you serve them. And then they become gods that can never produce life. They are all neutral things, and they can all be fantastic until they become your focus and your master, and you serve them, not the other way around. We even make ourselves out to be God, and we really have no power unless Yahweh gives power through us. We can even treat God like this, to be honest with you. God does not want to be known as El. He wants to be known as Yahweh. He is not in the pantheon of gods like all these other gods that we end up serving. We treat him like a pagan god. Like we barter with them. You know, I'll read my Bible if you'll do this. You know, I've been going to church and I've been living well, and you're not doing this. That's a pagan god. That is not Yahweh. God is the always creator parent. And all he really wants is intimacy with his creation. Like any good parent. He doesn't want to be bartered with. He wants to love and connect. He doesn't need appeasing to some uncontrolled judgment of anger. He wants to cleanse and renew and restore and heal and comfort. The only thing he really wants is you, because he's the great parent of all living things. He is life, and he's the only one that can provide it. And our response when we actually get this is this overwhelming sense of just wanting to love him back. My daughter Kelly and my son-in-law John showed up last night with their 3 kids. And the oldest, Bodie, my oldest grandson, we have quite a connection. And we bathed them last night, and he wears a pull-up at night and put his jammies on and tucked him in bed. And I made the mistake of leaving his water bottle right by his bed, which I guess you don't do. At 2 a.m, Bodie woke up, and he was right next to Gigi, his grandmother, and he was saying, I'm all wet, Gigi, I'm all wet. And I thought, oh my gosh, like, it's just a pull-up. It's not like you have to fasten the tape right. And by the way, I fasten tightly. Linda's terrible at it. I'm a great diaper fastener. I mean, they won't be able to breathe, but nothing's leaking through a Doug McBride diaper. This wasn't that. This was a pull-up. John comes out and says, you know what? Diaper was totally dry this morning. He took the water bottle, poured it all over himself in the bed so he could come be with us at 2 a.m. Isn't that awesome? Not when you're woken up at 2, but it actually is awesome. And you know what that makes me want to do? Just be with him all the more. And that's the reciprocal Yahweh relationship he wants with us. The Exodus isn't about just setting people free. It was to demonstrate to humanity that the Yahweh behind it all is our creator parent and friend and lover. So with that, let's turn then to God's name. How does this speak to God's name? By the way, and I said this before, to my knowledge, this is the only place in the Bible where a deity of any kind wants to make sure that everybody knows his real name. And it happens 2 times in the Bible. We looked at the first one 2 weeks ago. It was at the burning bush. You will never guess where the second time is that God says, you have to know my name. It's right before the plagues. God stresses his name again right before the plagues. Listen to this in Exodus 6. But Yahweh said to Moses, now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh. For with a strong hand he will send them out, and with a strong hand he will drive them out of this land. God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob in the book of Genesis as El, but my name is Yahweh. I did not make myself known to them. Why here at the precipice of the unleashing of power does God make such a big deal that he is not El, that he is Yahweh? He's the always. Why this now? And how does this deal of precision work to define Yahweh? Think back to the second of the 10 commandments. Remember what it said, you shall not have allegiance to any other Elohim before me. Indeed, there are other sources one might worship. That's what we just talked about. The climate, money, status, success, prestige, beauty, never making a mistake, being liked, family image, popularity, clinging to perfect health, recognition. But none of these are personal. None of these were ever meant to give you life. They were never meant to serve you, or to be served, but to serve you. God not only displayed El power like never seen before in the plagues, showing an uncanny ability to control everything all at once, God also displayed precision. God is personal. God is relational. God is precise in what he says and does. When God called me to be the lead pastor in this church, I've been doing this for 12 years. When God called me to do this, it was 8 years. I was 40 years old. I was at a training seminar for how to put small groups together in a church, and I'd get up and go down from 5 in the morning till 8 in the morning, and I did this for like 6 weeks. And there were 3 people that prophesied that I would be in this pulpit 8 years before it happened. One guy I didn't know. The other guy was at this seminar. I've never seen him before. I've never seen him since. And they all said the same thing. You're going to be in the pulpit at your church. And not just once or twice. You're going to be the main person in the pulpit. And that's what I've been doing. And then you'll never guess what happened when God told me to scale back 4 years ago. 3 people had prophecy to me that I would scale back. And one of them, I don't think she's in the room, or is she? Molly Lillis. Molly, are you in the room? Molly Lillis, when she spoke to me, she said to me, I'm supposed to tell you something. I don't even know what I'm saying, why I'm saying it, or what it means, but I think God wants you to know this and you'll know. And that's exactly what God was saying. And 2 other people had said the same thing using the same words. Precision. This is what God does. You know, when I was talking to Brian Fury about this, and he was so helpful because Brian said, you know, Doug, when I hear the word precision, I think of like a kind of a calculated, cold engineering, like mathematic term, right? Well, so I looked up the word precision in a thesaurus, right? Looked up synonyms for the word precision. This is the words that were used for precision. Faithful was the first one. Caring, right? Why caring? Because I'm going to make sure you know it's me. Moses says, let's just say it'll be around midnight. God goes, no, dude, that's not how I work. I'll be there at midnight. And he's not late. He's never late. You know, the next word was clearness. Boy, do we need that in our life. The next was allegiance. The next was constancy. The next was specific. He is Yahweh. He is the always. And he always gives life and love and truth. And God is precise. He wants to partner with us like he did with Moses. I shared a week or 2 weeks ago that I was down first week in January in Mexico. And this buddy of Jeff Clipness and mine, Bob Larson, what a dude, man. He is a mountain man. He lives, like you go to Healdsburg and then 45 minutes on a road that just is there to make you die. And then you get to his property. And then his driveway, Jeff, is what? It's like a quarter mile to get to the houses. Ansel Adams stayed at this ranch and took pictures of these houses. It's just amazing. So this guy invites me to me and Jeff couldn't make it, to spend a week with him in the Sonoran Desert in Mexico bow hunting. And just the development of this guy's faith and his sense of God over this last 15 years, just mind-boggling. So he's not like me. I shoot a compound bow, which has sights, and the arrow flies 340 feet per second. I mean, it's almost like a gun. He uses a stick bow. It's something you see in like cowboy and Indian movies. I mean, it's primitive. This he's a just amazing hunter. So he goes over to his place, I go over to my spot, and I kill a deer, and he shoots a deer, but he doesn't find it. And if you're not a hunter, I actually don't respect that. But if you're not a hunter, I'll just explain this anyway. When you shoot something and you don't find it, it's a terrible feeling. And you're up all night. You're just worried you're not going to find it. You don't want to wound an animal. And this guy, it's his third trip to the Sonoran Desert to shoot one of these Coues deer. And the outfitter, really faithful Christian guy, is like, Bob, don't worry, we're going to find it. You know, the coyotes, the crows, whatever, the ravens, they'll be on it. So he says, you go hunt for like 2 or 3 hours in the morning, then I'll come and find you in your tent, and then we'll go look. So Bob says, okay. So Bob's just sitting, and he's kind of a nervous wreck, and he's sitting in his tent for 3 hours, and there's deer all in front of him, and a raven comes. And the raven lands right above his head in the tree. And Bob said, Doug, I grew up in the woods. I live in the woods. I understand ravens. I mean, ravens are highly intelligent, by the way. They make like 100 sounds. You can actually teach a raven to speak. They're that smart. And this raven starts squawking right at me. And it drove all the deer away. And Doug, this raven, he said, was making sounds I've never heard in my life. Ever. I spent my whole life listening to ravens. It was talking to me. And he said, I knew right then. He said 2 things. He said, oh, this is so touching. He said, first of all, I knew God was telling me something. This guy does not talk like this normally. And then he looked at me with tears in his eyes and he said, and I knew you were praying that I'd find my deer. And I said, I was, Bob. I was on my knees in my tent. I had just shot my deer. I just came back in my tent and I got on my knees and I said, God, just give him favor. Just give him favor. He said, I knew. The raven was for me. I don't care if you believe this or not. It's so cool. Then the raven took off, and he said, I knew God was saying, get out of your tent. It's time to go. Grabbed my bow, and I started walking, and that raven flew right in the direction that my deer walked off the night before. So I followed him, like 800 yards. And then I had this inclination, just this little voice like we all get inside of us every now and then that we don't trust, unfortunately. And he said, the inclination was just grab an arrow and just take a practice shot. So he said, sure. So he took an arrow out and he went right at a stick, hit the stick about 15 yards out and bounced and flew into the brush. And 25 buzzards got up. And he went up. And he followed the arrow to go pick it up, and right where the arrow landed was this deer. And he was just like, is that the coolest thing you ever heard? I said, Bob, that was about the coolest thing I've ever heard. That's precision. It's relational. Do you hear that? I got on the plane to fly home, flew to Phoenix. Then you had to check my carcasses and check back in, and I get on the plane. As I'm getting on the plane, it was a smaller plane. There were only like 2 rows of business class, so I go through that, of course. And then at the bulkhead, I see a man and a woman. They're about my daughter and my son-in-law's age, and they've got 2 little kids. They've got a 3-year-old, 2-year-old, and a 6-month-old. And all I'm thinking is, that's a rough deal. If you've flown with kids, and you're just panicked. You're kind of like, oh, please don't scream. Oh, we're going up. Put some milk in their mouth. Oh, we're going down. Oh, no. And so I sit like 3 rows behind him. And as soon as we strap in, that 6-month-old starts screaming and screaming and screaming. And immediately you're a little like, ugh. And then you go, oh, that poor couple. Oh, it's the pressure on them. And then I could just sense God drawing me into this conversation with him, just drawing me in to talk to him about it. And I just closed my eyes and I said, Father, this poor couple, can you just settle their baby down? Can you just quiet their child? And I don't mean just for a minute. I want to do this together. I want it the whole flight. And not for me. And not even for the rest of these people. For them. And it just went silent. There's a part of you that's like, that worked. But there was a part of me that was like, well, of course that worked. He cares. And he's very precise. And we landed, and the baby let out a little peep when the wheels touched down, just to let us all know the baby was still there. And I'm walking out and with Bob, and I see this couple with their kids. And like Tom Aftal, he says, like, God, no, I'm not doing that. No, I'm not doing that. Well, they were waiting because apparently they had grandparents, but they're more intelligent grandparents than we are. They sat like in the back of the plane to not deal with it. I should have met with the grandparents and said, can you mentor me? Because we're stupid. We sit with them. And I walked over to the mom, and she looked at me because this weird dude's coming over to her, and I kind of patted her on the arm, and I said, your kids were so great on that flight. It was just so neat to see. She goes, yeah, we were so relieved. And I could hear God was just... So I said, I know this is going to sound weird, and I don't even know why I'm telling you this, because I never do this, but God told me to pray for you. And to pray that your child will be just quiet so you guys could have a peaceful flight. And as soon as I prayed that, your baby went silent. They both looked at me like, weirdo. And I agree, by the way. And then they caught themselves and they just said, thank you. That's super kind of you. And I walked off. And it was like, God, what was that about? Exodus 3. Elohim also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, Yahweh, the Elohim of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This Yahweh, this is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. See what God's saying to us? You're worried about whether or not we can have a relationship. You got to stop worrying. Don't worry so much. You and I, we go way back. I made you. I thought of you. I conceived of you in my mind before I conceived you through your mother. This is what the Father says. So this is my closing question. I have to close with putting something on you. What are you giving excess focus to? What consumes your thoughts? And is it something you're giving power to where you are now serving it rather than the other way around? What non-divine force are you giving power to that it was never supposed to have? And you'll know what it is because it's what you think about and it's what you're telling other people about. In the Exodus, we're going to see this is not just about a display of God's great power, which of course it is. And it's not just about rescuing Israel, which of course it is. It's about making his name known to us. He always wants to meet you in a precise and specific way because he wants to be with you and partner with you because he not only likes you, he respects you. And he wanted to do this, by the way, not just for Israel. He actually even wanted to do this for Egypt. And he even wanted to do this for this ugly little tyrant Pharaoh. That's what we're going to turn to next week. We're going to process this idea where it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and then God holds him responsible. So what's going on there? That's it. Amen to Yahweh. We're going to have a prayer team up front. Boy, Isaac was right. This really was it's really sad. Really sorry about that. We're going to have a prayer team come up. They're here to process with you. answer anything that you need to process with. If you need prayer, don't leave here without talking to somebody, either up here or somebody next to you. Would you stand with me in closing? And I want to just pray. Instead of doing a benediction over you, I just heard this morning that Irv, our beloved Irv, the guy that hosted last week, in case you're new here, his father just passed away. And it was not expected. Irv he's a dear brother, talked so many times about his dad with me and where he grew up on the East Coast in D.C. and just the way his parents raised him, unlike kind of his neighborhood that he grew up in. And so I just want to pray for Irv and for God's comfort for him. So would you pray with me? Yahweh, the always, our active listener, the one who sees us, the one who experientially knows in empathy because you step into our life. We just lay this good, godly man before you and his family and his wife and kids. It's a weird thing when your dad dies. You're kind of forced to crawl another rung up the ladder, even though don't feel ready for it. You don't want it. Would you just speak strength into him in that? Would you enter into that with him, as I know you will? Would you do something today in a specific way, in a precise way, so that he knows you're there? He knows you see him. And would you fill that void and that grief in his life and in his family's life? Father, these great people before me that I get to sit with every week, they're so different than this world. They're here, they put time aside to worship you, to learn of you, to listen to your voice. They are the kingdom of warriors to stomp darkness out under the power of your Spirit. Would you strengthen them? Would you uplift them? Would you heal them and encourage them? Would you take something from this morning's words from you out of your text and speak strength and encouragement into them? I pray this in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And all God's people said,